That now? Just said recording in progress. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is our final session for this year's course, which was alternate Jewish history, asking a series of questions of what if. We started in ancient times. What if the Romans hadn't destroyed the temple in 70? We then went to late ancient times with what if the Abbasids had not defeated the Umayyads, and then Baghdad, the Babylonian academies wouldn't have been central. We talked about what if the Emperor Frederick had not died after only 100 days in office in 1888? Would Germany have gone a different direction? What if Germany had won World War I instead of lost it? And that makes a difference in terms of where the Holocaust, what happens with the Holocaust. And then last time we talked about what if the Holocaust had not happened and what that would have meant for the future of Israeli Judaism and American Judaism. About half of the things that I've chosen were essential in choosing one direction rather than another, and the other half not so much. Today is kind of in the middle. The topic for today, and I'll put on the share screen here. Give me a second. Let's just figure that out. No. I'm just maneuvering around my computer here. There we go. From the beginning. Okay. So what if Rabin had not been assassinated in 1995? So of all of the moments that we've been discussing in this series of what ifs across Jewish history, this is, for me, it's the most personal because it's the only event in the series that I remember. That the last was the Holocaust. We have people today who were alive at the time of the Holocaust who remember it. I was not, but I remember the Rabin assassination very well. One of those moments where you can remember where you were when you found out the news. I was at a convention of the United Synagogue with a group of that was representing Koach, which was the conservative movement's program of outreach to college students. It's currently been defunded and does not exist anymore. But at that time, we went to the United Synagogue Biennial Convention to request for increased funding, which we made the case well, and they did at that time increase the funding for the college outreach program. And it was, so being in an environment with a small group of fellow college students, and although I was a college graduate at that point, I was on staff with the group. And at the same time, a larger group of leaders from conservative synagogues from across the country and Canada could not have been a more emotional place to be, basically with hundreds of other Jewish leaders. At the time that the news came, I was sitting in a session that Elliot Dorff was teaching. Rabbi Elliot Dorff is the provost of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, is currently the chair of the law committee, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly. And he was teaching a session about what we mean by resurrection of the dead. He's both a Jewish scholar of Jewish law and of Jewish thought. And in the middle of that session, we were in an auditorium as the professor was speaking, and then the door suddenly burst open, and someone from one of the top leaders of the United Synagogue ran in and said, Prime Minister Rabin has been shot. And then, that was it. And it was actually a Shabbos. It was a Shabbos afternoon, I remember. So we didn't have access. Most people were not watching TV, and we didn't really carry phones then. And and even if we were, they weren't smart like they are now, where you get news bleeps all the time. So we're dependent on sort of like the people that knew what was going on, following the news and the TV and the bar or the lobby, and then running into all the sessions and telling people what was happening. So there was these gasps. We didn't know how he was shot or what happened. And then it was about a half an hour, and we didn't know what to do. And Rabbi Dorff said, well, we pray you should, a refuah shlema, you should heal quickly. And then he went to continue teaching. And then it was within 20 minutes, then the door burst open again. And the same person from the leadership said, terrible news, the prime minister is dead, he's been assassinated. And there were most audible gasp, and there must have been silence. It must have been at least somewhere between 75 and 100 people in the room, all from, again, Jewish leaders from all over the country. And then after about a few minutes of silence, Rabbi Dorff said, well, in the spirit of his memory, talking about resurrection of the dead and what the future holds. And so we should, let's continue learning. And then he went on to teach for about 2 minutes. And then meanwhile, people were murmuring among themselves. People were getting up, leaving the room, wanting to go to their rooms or the lobby, or go in their rooms and turn on the TV, see what was going on. And then at one person, someone raised their hand and said, I'm sorry, Professor, but I really, I can't concentrate. And this was a terrible, shocking tragedy. And we need to see the TV. We need to call our families. And he said, okay, and then we dispersed from the room and spent the next hour or two watching TV, and then came together. And this was all on Shabbat afternoon. And that I tell that story not only because it's I remember it like it was just yesterday, the shock of the news, but also being surrounded in a place with Jewish leaders and yet not knowing what to do. And Rabbi Dorff, who was our leader there, said, well, what we need to do is hope for the future. And that's what Tchiyat HaMeitim, that's what resurrection means. Understand, Elliot Dorff does not believe literally that decayed corpses will be resurrected at any point. He was talking about what it means what role that serves as a symbol in Jewish thought and what the metaphor stands for. So he says the metaphor is that we have hope for the future even after tragedy and after loss. And that is the only message that you can bring out of tragedy. And yet no one in the room was ready to hear it. And we still had to focus on the here and now before we could think about the future. And that's sort of where we still are so much in Israel's continual struggle with the Palestinians and the nature of Israel, that we're focused so much on the short-term emergency that never seems to end. And then how do we find a way to have hope for the future and move forward? Were there moments when we could have stepped that line into a more secure future, and was that missed? So what would have happened had Rabin not been assassinated in 1995? This was what was happening after Shabbat, just as Shabbat ended, Motzei Shabbat, November 5th, 1995. It was Saturday night in Israel, which is why it was Saturday afternoon or midday in the United States when I was at that convention. So after Shabbat, it was a gathering of over 100,000 supporters, was a peace rally in Tel Aviv. It's called the Square of the Kings of Israel, Kikar Malchei Yisrael, but now it's called Rabin Square. It was renamed Rabin Square in his memory, and it's the largest open square in Tel Aviv, right in the downtown area. And those, you see the piece now, these are students in support of the peace process. They're all Meretz, Labor. Those are the parties that were made up the most of the coalition that was supporting Rabin, keeping him in power. There's Shalom, which means peace, Shalom Achshav, which is Hebrew for peace now, which is the peace movement. And this rally was very, very important because what was going on with Rabin? Rabin, as you know, was the commanding general during the 67 war, which was the war where Israel found itself in control of vast territories, the Sinai Desert that Israel subsequently returned to Egypt, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights. And since then, Jerusalem was annexed and unified under one municipality. The Golan Heights were annexed as a part of Israel, 1981, I think. And you know about the Gaza, and the West Bank. We'll go into a little more detail about that coming up. So in a sense, he was the general that presided over the creation of the circumstance that's created, in a sense, some of the issues, although the issues between the Israelis and Palestinians were not created in 1967. They go back to 1948 and 49 when Israel was first created. And you have already then hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are displaced from their homes in what we call Israel proper, inside the Green Line, and found themselves in refugee camps in the West Bank or Gaza that between 1949 and 1967 were administered by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, and then came under Israeli authority in 1967. So Rabin was the general, was the military architect, and now he's prime minister in his second term as prime minister, and he finds himself the leader of the Israeli government at the time of the Oslo Accords, when which was really negotiated by Shimon Peres, his rival in the Labor Party, who was his foreign minister, and it was the agreement that Peres made with the PLO. The basic agreement was that the PLO would organize itself and establish the Palestinian Authority, and they would revise their charter of their organization, so they were no longer calling for the destruction of Israel. And there was an initial withdrawal of Israel from the areas of dense Palestinian population. We'll get to the map, I'll show you that. And Israel would have a gradual withdrawal from the rest of the area, and they would negotiate final status over where the Jewish neighborhoods are, and also over Jerusalem. And those were the final status talks, because Jerusalem was the hot potato. So we'll deal with that later. Let's at least get something going for now. And of course, those final status agreements have never occurred. Rabin was always hesitant he was not as embracing of the peace movement as Shimon Peres was. Rabin was a real centrist, and it's one of the reasons why he's always been one of my heroes. He was my hero before he was assassinated. And he decided to move forward with the peace process, and it was so divisive in Israel in 1992, 93, 94, into 95. These are the years of his second term as prime minister. Even though a part of that was the Oslo Accords, a part of it was the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. Part of it was the Nobel Peace Prize, which he received along with Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat. And yet it was obviously very polarizing in Israel. And what happens in Israel, someone needs to mute. There's some background noise there. I'm not sure who it is. I think it's Jake Haber. Okay, muted you. There we go. Get my train of thought back. There was a no confidence vote, attempts to bring down the government. And Rabin's coalition was Labor Party with Meretz on the left, and there are some signs from the Meretz party there, and with Shas on the right. Shas is one of the ultra-Orthodox parties. The coalition started to fall apart as he moved forward with the peace process, both from Shas and from some right-wing members of the coalition, individuals. And there was a no confidence vote where he didn't have the 61 requisite votes to support the government, because the way that the Israeli political system works is there are 120 seats in the Knesset, in the parliament. So in order to establish a government, you have to control 61 of the 120 seats, which gives you a majority. If you don't, then the government falls and you have a new election. And the new election would usually determine the new government, except now when we've been in this standstill because every election is inconclusive. Netanyahu is governing as I call a caretaker prime minister. So there was an attempt to bring down Rabin's government. And one of the big issues now, and this almost happened before the Gaza conflict with Hamas just a week and a half ago, was that there was an Arab party that was going to go in coalition with the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And never has an Arab party served in the Israeli government, even though the Arabs represent about 18% of the population and do win seats in the Knesset. It's a big hot potato issue in Arab politics in Israel among Israeli Arabs, whether they should vote for the Knesset or not, because if they partake in the election, then it's a granting legitimacy to the Israeli regime. So some don't vote as a protest, and others say we need to vote in order to be represented. That's how the democratic process works. So there was a possibility that an Islamist party actually was going to join this anti-Netanyahu bloc and form a new government. Whether that can happen after the violence of the last couple of weeks is an open question. It's certainly harder to do now than it was before. And it's part of the issue is that a lot of at least the centrist parties and the right-wing parties have never wanted to sit in government with an Arab party because they want to be committed to the Zionist idea of Israel as a Jewish state. And if you have non-Jewish parties in the government, then it's not fully a Jewish state. When the no confidence vote came for Rabin, and he didn't have enough support for his government, the no confidence vote still failed. And the reason why it failed was because the Arab parties in the Knesset voted against the no confidence measure. And this was a tricky thing, a parliamentary trick they're able to do. They weren't voting in favor of the government. The question before the Knesset was a no confidence motion. So you're voting in favor of the motion, which is against the government. So by voting against the anti-government motion, they basically voted for the government without actually voting to put the government in power. And since the government was already in power, it's then not going to fall. So this was a very in-between thing that the Arab parties were able to do in order to keep Rabin in power. And Rabin was challenged on that. And he was challenged by the right. And they said, how can you bring about a peace? How can you claim to be a legitimate leader if you don't have a majority of the Jewish people in Israel supporting you as the prime minister? And Netanyahu answered, Yitzhak Rabin answered the question, and he spoke always in sort of a baritone, slow voice. And he said in Hebrew, of course, but he said, the prime minister can govern with a majority of one. That's the basic law. That as long as there weren't 61 votes against the government remains in power. He refused to be bullied out of office. And he said, as long as he's in office, he will move forward on the program. And even though he was hesitant, and I didn't put this picture up, but there's that famous picture at the Oslo signing, the signing accords at the White House, which was after the Oslo agreement with President Clinton. And Arafat extends his hand to Rabin, and you could see Rabin is hesitant and he's uncomfortable shaking Arafat's hand, yet he moved forward. So he was a hesitant peacemaker, but once he made up his mind, he could not be moved from that position. The purpose of this rally on November 5th, 1995 was to shore up the peace side in Israel wanted to shower the prime minister with as much support and strength as they could. And he was incredibly moved by the event. It was the last hour of his life. And it was one of the most moving because he had hundreds of thousands of people that sang with him, and then they asked to sing a song. And what he's holding there is he's holding the lyrics of a song that's called Shir LaShalom, a song of peace. And next to him is the singer, who's leading the song. And they gave him the words. And you see there's a man there who's holding a microphone so that the prime minister's voice could be picked up. Yitzhak Rabin was not a singer. And not only was he not a singer, he didn't know the words, and that they had to give it to him on a piece of paper for him to read the lyrics. This was a song, it was a well-known peace song. I mean, I grew up singing it at Camp Ramon in school. We knew the song. He didn't know the song, he didn't know the words well enough. So he needed the lyrics in front of him in order to sing it at the peace rally, but he did. And he was not a touchy-feely kind of guy, and he did that. And then this is a few minutes later, and this was found. These are the words that he's holding in his hands, and that's his blood on the lyrics of the song. And you can see that in Israel. There's an exhibit about Rabin right off the side of where he was shot in what's called Rabin Square. And it's just this picture with his blood spilled on the words of a prayer, of a song that's a prayer for peace. Says so much. And the thought then was that could the future still go on, or has things changed because he was assassinated? And then this is at the funeral of Rabin. This is the sitting president, the first lady, and the immediate past president here, Clinton, and Bush. And they're not just mourning for the man, Yitzhak Rabin, they're mourning for, they see as whether the process that they had invested so much in, where this was going, the direction of things to us that got things going towards Oslo was in many ways a direct result of the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War that was presided under the first President Bush, when the idea was we could create a new, a new world order. It's a term that he used, and then that the secret discussions between Shimon Peres and the Israelis and the Palestinians was after that context, and then and President Clinton had then worked to bring the two sides together. There's the sense here is that the future that we were dreaming of, is that future still a possibility? You might remember President Clinton's powerful eulogy at Rabin's funeral, when he ended with Shalom Chaver, goodbye friend. And after that, he recited in Hebrew the last line of the mourner's Kaddish, Aseh Shalom Bimramavi, Aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen. And then he says, Shalom Chaver, goodbye friend. And the next year, there were bumper stickers all over Israel that said, Shalom, Chaver, goodbye friend. You saw signs and all over that his two Hebrew words that President Clinton used became a slogan for goodbye friend, the friend that Rabin was, but is it also a goodbye to the hope of a more peaceful future or not? So moving, what happened here? 1 second. There we go. So let's talk about what Rabin and Clinton and the Palestinian leadership and Shimon Peres, what they were actually working on. This is the basic scenario that was set up by the Oslo Accords. And what you see is the green area is inside of the green line. That's the line there. That is a green line, I guess. That's the armistice line from 1949. It's where the independents were, where the fighting stopped. And that was the area that at least everyone in the world can agree on, that area being Israel, right? There's the other areas, the rest of Jerusalem, the territory areas that's disputed, but there's no dispute by any in international law, except by, of course, the countries that don't recognize Israel, right? But the ones but in terms of international law, that is Israel proper, is the term that I like to use. And what we see here was a division into, there's 4, but the areas of the territories, and this doesn't include the Golan, that's an issue between Israel and Syria, and Israel annexed it. But these were the areas here that Israel took over in 67. Then there's four categories: A, B, C, and Jerusalem. So area A is the dark purple. It's most of the Gaza Strip, very densely populated, includes Gaza City. There's Ramallah, which is currently where Mahmoud Abbas has his offices, is Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, Nablus, Jenin, Tulkara. Those are the big Palestinian cities, densely populated. So there, full control was granted to the Palestinian Authority, because Israel said, we're not interested in being policemen for millions and millions of Palestinian Arabs in their cities. So the Palestinian Authority, as a result of the Oslo Accords, took control over those areas. Then area B, which is the, I guess that orange area, are other populated areas that it says Palestinian Administration, Israeli Security. So those are areas, those are Palestinian villages where the PA controls domestic affairs, but the Israeli army patrols and can go in, where the agreement was the Israeli army would not enter into area A. And they have preserved that for all these years, except for when there's been security emergencies. Area C is still to be negotiated. Area C is the white area, that's desert. So because it's desert, we figure it out later, because that's where we figure out where the final borders are. There's strategic issues with the desert, but they're not densely populated, they're sparsely populated. And finally, Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has to be negotiated separately, because I said Jerusalem is a hot potato. Roughly, East Jerusalem is mostly Arab, West Jerusalem is Jewish. The old city is very complicated. You have pockets of Jewish populations in the east, in the north, the south. It's a very, very complicated. So the decision in Oslo, which everyone thought was a great decision then, although now it's also easy to play Monday morning quarterback. It says, let's put it on the back burner. We'll get to Jerusalem later. Let's just solve everything else first. This was the idea of the Oslo Accord and the peace process. And the reason why it's called a process is because it's gradual, because Israel immediately stepped back from Gaza, Ramallah, Jericho, Bethlehem, Hebron, Nablus, Jenin, Tulkara, Kabylia, and some, and then a few other small places. And then there would be a gradual pulling back and coordination between the Israeli army and the Palestinian Authority. And this was all happening very, very quickly. So quick review of the history. What happened was that when Rabin was killed, Shimon Peres became acting prime minister, but then they had to have an election, and Peres called for a new election as soon as possible. He didn't need to do that, Peres. He could have served the remainder of that parliament's term and then carried through and the peace process. But Peres thought, Rabin is a martyr for peace. Now people are going to come out in droves and vote for the Labor Party, which was Rabin's party, which now Shimon Peres was leading. And now we will have a mandate from the people to move forward on the peace. So better to do that than do it now when there's still that question of the legitimacy of the government, because they didn't have a Jewish majority anymore. So Peres calls for a new election. That was, in retrospect, that was a bad call, because he lost the election to Benjamin Netanyahu. And the reason why he lost the election was there was a terrorist campaign then of bus bombings, and then the electorate, or at least the independent, the undeclared voters in the middle, shifted to the right because of the terrorist attacks. It's also personal to me. I had a good friend of mine, or a classmate of mine, in rabbinical school, who was killed that year in one of those bus bombs, it was in Jerusalem, and was killed on his way to the bus to take a vacation to Jordan. as a result, again, of Rabin's policies of having peace between Israel and Jordan, to be able to visit Jordan. And on the local bus, on the way to the central bus station, the bus was blown up. So Netanyahu became prime minister. That was his first term. But he's then defeated by Ehud Barak, who is the new leader of labor. And Barak came forward with the idea of, let's finish what Rabin started and make the peace. And that's the 2000, we called Camp David II, where it was Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat holed up at Camp David with Bill Clinton. And Arafat would not agree, in the end, would not agree to the deal. It was the deal that Mahmoud Abbas has been begging for Israel to accept now, but Barak was very clear. He said, it's on the table now. If you don't take this deal, he won't be able to remain prime minister and the deal's going to disappear. And that's what happened, because then when Barak fell from power, then the Israeli politics then moved to the right, and they haven't, Labor Party has been rather insignificant since then. And what happened after that? So then when Barak lost the election, but the new leader of the Likud party of the right was not Netanyahu, because Netanyahu was the prime minister who became prime minister after the Rabin Peres government, and then he lost the election to Ehud Barak. So now the new leader of the Likud party is Ariel Sharon. And this is another what if, but I'm combining this in the same talk. Ariel Sharon is the guy on the right. You know who the man on the left is. And Ariel Sharon was prime minister, and he had a debilitating stroke on January 4th, 2006. And then he was basically in a coma until he died in 2014, I think. He lived on for another 8 years, but he never woke from the coma as a result of the debilitating stroke on January 4th, 2006. So Ariel Sharon represented the right wing of the Likud. And we'll go back to Rabin. This is actually a more significant turning point, because Sharon came to the same realization that Yitzhak Rabin had come to, that Israel cannot sustain this continued conflict, the Palestinians. You can't annex all that area where the Palestinians live, because then you're going to have millions of Arab citizens of Israel. And if you're going to be a democracy, then you're not going to be a Jewish state anymore. And neither can you continue to occupy it indefinitely, because the tensions are just going to grow and grow, and there'll be outbursts of violence and terrorism. And it's also besides that, it's also not a long-term solution to control a hostile territory that does not serve the long-term interests of Israel's security, because they're not, the surrounding area is not secure. So Sharon had reached that decision, but Sharon saw that there was no partner on the Palestinian side. And that was the difference between Sharon and when Rabin was in charge, that Rabin and Peres were working with Arafat, and they thought they could work through the deal. Maybe they could have worked it out had Rabin lived, maybe. But by the time Ehud Barak becomes prime minister in 2000, which is 5 years after Rabin's assassination, Arafat it proved to be a non-partner. It's a famous story that Bill Clinton tells at the end of his memoir, his last day in the Oval Office, when all the world leaders were calling him, congratulating him on his 8 years as president. He got the call from Yasser Arafat, and Arafat says, "Mr. President, you are a great man." And Clinton says, "No, I'm not a great man. I'm a failure, and you made me that." And he says this, it's like the last page of my life, of Clinton's memoir. It's because Arafat would not accept what Barak put on the table. They worked out a deal. It was everyone would have come out with something. Basically, Israel would have withdrawn from the territories. The Jewish areas in the territories would be part of Israel, and there would be a swap of land. Certain parts of Israel would then be given to Palestine. They would work out a split in Jerusalem. It could be the capital of both countries. East Jerusalem is Palestine, West Jerusalem is Israel. this holy sites in the old city would be shared. There would be access to it. They worked it out. The diplomats worked it all out, and Arafat said, "No, I can't take the deal." So Sharon, who is to the right of Rabin, but also a hardened general, Sharon says, "We can't continue this way. We can't continue indefinitely." But he said, because there's no partner, we're going to unilaterally make a peace. We're just going to unilaterally withdraw. The Palestinians can't agree to anything. We'll tell them where the borders are. And phase one of that withdrawal was the pull out of Gaza. But he had every intention of pulling out of the majority of the West Bank, and he was just going to establish where the borders were and give the Palestinians a state and be magnanimous that way. Netanyahu was also remained a very powerful member of the Likud, even though he wasn't the leader. These are the two of them during Sharon's premiership, and there was tremendous tension. And as Sharon moved forward to the unilateral withdrawal of from Gaza, Netanyahu then left. He voted against Sharon's premiership, and he tried to bring down Sharon as the prime minister because Netanyahu was that opposed to the Israeli army's withdrawal from Gaza. And he led a contest contesting Sharon's leadership of the Likud party to remove Sharon as leader of the party. And Sharon was a brilliant tactician. So what Sharon says, he said to Bibi Netanyahu, he said, "You want the Likud? You can have the Likud. You can have what's left of it. I'm forming my own party." And it was called the Kadima party. And he formed it between the left wing of the Likud and the right wing of the Labor. And Ehud Olmert, who was the right-wing Likud mayor of Jerusalem, joined Sharon. And Tzipi Livni, who was an up-and-coming Likud leader, joined Sharon. And from the other side, Shimon Peres, twice former prime minister, Ben Gurion's lieutenant, one of the most famous labor leaders of all time, left the Labor Party and joined Sharon in the Kadima party. So you had this new centrist party, and he formed that party. He had overwhelming control of the Knesset, firm Jewish majority. He didn't need to depend on Arab votes like Rabin did. And he said, "This is what we're going to do." And the pull out of Gaza was a lot of tension about that intra-Jewish tension. But then before he could continue with the job and pull out of the West Bank and decide where the borders would be, he had a stroke. And his second in command was Ehud Olmert. So Ehud Olmert became the acting prime minister. And this was the same situation like when Shimon Peres became prime minister when Rabin was assassinated. And all this time, Netanyahu was in the opposition. And Ehud Olmert sat down, then it's Mahmoud Abbas, because Yasser Arafat had died already. And Olmert basically presented to Abbas the same deal. It was a newer, revised version than what Ehud Barak and Clinton had presented to Arafat. And it was all on the table, and Abbas could have taken it. But then there was an indictment against Ehud Olmert, and he had to resign. So he said, because of the corruption probe and because of the pending indictment, I have to resign as prime minister and will go to call for new elections. But he remained as the caretaker prime minister until the new government could be formed. And Mahmoud Abbas decided, which in retrospect, as so many other things, was a bad call. He decided that I'm not going to make the deal with Ehud Olmert because he's a lame duck prime minister. He's already resigned. He's going to be found guilty. He's been indicted. And how can you make an agreement? How can he lead the country if he's under indictment? That was Israel then. Israel's a different country now when the prime minister is under indictment and somehow magically is still able to run the country. So Olmert decided, let's wait till after the election and I'll make the deal with the new prime minister. So Olmert had to step down from the leadership position. So the next in command was Tzipi Livni. It wasn't Shimon Peres, because Shimon Peres was now the president already, which is the figurehead, the head of state. So they had this election then, and the election was Tzipi o Bibi, because those are the two nicknames. Tzipi is short for Tzipora, and Bibi is short for Benjamin, for Binyamin. Tzipi or Bibi or Tzipi, and it was the big election. And everyone knew what was at stake, because Tzipi Livni would have led Kadima to resolve the situation with the Palestinians, and Netanyahu was running opposed to that and representing the right-wing opposition. And what happened in that election was that Tzipi Livni's party won more votes than the Likud party that Netanyahu was now the leader of. And it had one more seat in the Knesset than the Likud party. But if you count the smaller parties and you looked at the bloc, the right-wing bloc had more supporters than the Kadima, and Labor is now tiny and Meretz is tiny and the other parties on the left. So Shimon Peres, who was the president's job is to give the mandate, the first chance to form a government. So it was great ironies of history that Shimon Peres has to give that mandate to Bibi Netanyahu to form a government, even though Tzipi Livni got more votes than Netanyahu. And Netanyahu has been prime minister ever since. And you know, there's a story there. So the reason why I say this is it's more of a turning point than Netanyahu's assassination. We think, Rabin's assassination. Had Rabin not been assassinated, he would have pushed through the peace. Maybe he would have. But Israel was very polarized. And Sharon, I believe, is even stronger than Rabin. Sharon was like Nixon going to China. Right? And I think there was, if we imagine the what ifs, maybe there would have been a peace established after Rabin, but there was a much higher chance that it wouldn't have been the peace that the Palestinians necessarily wanted from Sharon, but it would have been something. And it would have been a way for a state of Palestine to start. And then the focus of the world would have been on, it wouldn't have been tied to Israel, because there would have been an agreement then that there would have been buy-in from the major powers. And that's a very different direction, which brings us to where we are today and up here. So where we are today, right, is the conflict. So much of these conflicts every few years between Israel and Hamas are fought over Gaza, because the Hamas won in a parliamentary election with the Palestinians, whereas Mahmoud Abbas, as the president, controls the executive branch. They could not resolve their internal conflict. So Hamas takes control of Gaza. Fatah, which is the party of Mahmoud Abbas, retains control of the West Bank. So you have a split, a division between the yet unformed country of Palestine that's divided geographically by the parts of Israel, the Negev in the center of Israel, that divides the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. And Hamas, connected with Hezbollah, supported by Iran, builds up this arsenal, and every now and then the hostilities break forth. And Israel's policy has been to go in each time to do damage to Hamas. Thank God Israel has the Iron Dome to defend them from the onslaught of missiles. This conflict that we saw last week, the week before, was shorter than the other ones, but also of much greater exponential intensity in terms of the ability and the number of missiles and the long-range missiles and the precision of the missiles that are coming out of Gaza. And there's such frustration now on both sides, right? From the Palestinian side, the sense of what future is there, and on the Israeli side also, in terms of what can be done. And a lot of that is, whether there'll be a new government being able to form now, or whether there'll be yet another election, and whether the electorate will give a clear direction or not. Clearly, the Israeli electorate is split, because the country remains polarized, and there's no clear choice forward. And in my opinion, Netanyahu is not, while he has many extraordinary abilities, one thing he's not done is show a direction, a viable direction towards the continuation of that peace process and the settlement of the issues between Israel and the Palestinians. It was something that Rabin and Ariel Sharon were not happy about, but they had made forceful decisions and were moving forward in that direction. So that's why 1995 and 2006 were 2 points where Israel lost key leaders who had the strength and the chutzpah to move Israel in a direction to change the circumstance. And when you, in both cases, one was an assassination and one was a stroke. In both cases, because of those events removing, and that both were effective in removing the leader, it shifted the direction that Israel went. And as I said, and I said this before, I believe that it was Sharon's stroke that was more conclusive than Netanyahu, than Rabin's assassination. Because when Israelis talk about now, even in the last week with the conflict with Gaza, they say it was a terrible thing that Israel withdrew from the Gaza. The unilateral withdrawal is, most Israelis believe that now, even if they supported Sharon, because the effect of the withdrawal was that Gaza fell to Hamas, Fatah was not able to retain control, and it became a launching pad for missiles that have continued to terrorize Israel. And Israel's had no choice but to defend itself, which is turned into a PR nightmare every time. And we've been caught in this never-ending nightmare on both sides. But what I say is, when we look at the history, it was never Sharon's intent to withdraw from the Gaza and that be the end of the story the way things are now. Sharon's intent was that was just the beginning, and there was going to be, he was going to redraw the entire map. And it's no surprise that Netanyahu was a very different approach than Sharon, because they opposed each other. That Bibi was the opposition to Sharon when he was prime minister, even though they both stemmed from the right. If Rabin had not been assassinated, would things have gone differently? I hope so. I hope so. So I want to just end with one thing. I'm going to go back to the slides there. Here we go. The words of the song. Sorry, let me flip. Oh, here we go. These are the words of the song. The end. Oh, sorry. That Rabin was singing. I'll give you a little Hebrew lesson. I decided not to put it in English so I could teach you a little of the Hebrew. And we'll talk about this idea. I mean, Elliot Dorff, the story I told at the beginning, Rabbi Dorff, he was trying to do anything he could. He didn't know what to do. He was giving a lecture. He committed to give a talk at a convention. And then he said it happened to be about what resurrection of the dead means. So what does that mean for hope? This is also about prayer, but about peace. And you might, it's the end of the song. Let me sing it, and then I'll teach you in the Hebrew. Al tagidu yom yavo, haviu et hayom, ki lo chalom hu vechol hakikarot, hariu leshalom. Bashir.
Rabbi, you're frozen. You're frozen, Rabbi.
Yeah. No sound.
You're frozen, Rabbi.
You have to close out and come back in.
Looks like he left and is going to come back in.
Hopefully he had no stroke.
Wednesday, I'm not free at all. Wednesday, I'm not. Yeah, Thursday, that's a possibility. Yeah, I'll put it down. I'll write that. Okay. I'm writing it down. Well, that's it, because it's a work, really a work day, for me, but, so what, but I can come, I can certainly spare an hour,
Rebecca, please mute your screen, mute your sound.
Well, I don't know, I gotta see what's happening with my PT, I might not have, I don't think I have any more PT, because there's Medicare, I gotta wait or something about it.
Rebecca, please mute your system.
At the moment, for, in June, so I'll be flexible. So let's just talk about them this week. I gotta see how much I progress with my project for school. Okay. All right, 11 o'clock, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right, whatever, okay.
Rebecca,
Who's calling me?
I am. Can you mute your screen, please?
Mute your mic, Rebecca. Just mute.
I'm back. Hello.
Hello?
Isn't that a classic COVID-19 when I get to the last 5 minutes of the year's program and then I lose the connection right then. It's classic, right? Thanks for standing by so I could restore the connection. So you were there when I was singing this passage from the song?
The first few lines we heard, yes.
Okay, so let me sing this again and then I'll teach it to you. Goes like this. Al tagidu yom yavo, haviyu et hayom, ki lo chalomu vechol hakikarot, v'riyu leshalom, v'shiru shiru shir leshalom, al techashu tefillah, mutav tashiru shir leshalom, okay, so that's the song that Rabin sang that he's holding in this picture that he's holding in his hands. And it's the song that you see here with his blood on the lyrics of. So I'll just read, Al tagidu yom yavo. Don't tell a story that the day will come. Tagidu is from the word.
Could you put the Hebrew on the screen, please?
It is on the screen.
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's not on our screen.
Okay, here we go. See it now?
Yay.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
So again, this is, I was just flipping through. It's the song that he's holding here in his hands. It's the song that I showed the slide of with his blood on it when he was shot, because he folded it up. You see it's folded a few ways and he put it in his blazer pocket as he was walking out, and then he was shot as he left the podium heading to his car at the end of the rally. So here are the words for the song. And so al tagidu yom yavo, don't say the word will come. Al means don't. Tagidu is from the word haggadah, which means to tell a story. So it says, don't tell the story that the day will come. Haviu et hayom, the day is here. Meaning, don't just tell some story about something that's going to happen in the future. Like traditionally, we talk about the resurrection of the dead, the Messiah. Okay, it's a nice story. It says, no, this day is here. Hilo chalom hu, because it is not a dream. Chalom is the word for dream. And it reminds one of the famous line from Theodore Herzl that says, if you will it, it is no dream. And that in fact, that Israel exists because they turned a dream into reality. The same thing that is the establishment of peace is not a dream. Uv'chol hakikarot hariu leshalom, and in all of the the public squares. They will call out shalom, and they're singing this with Rabin. Again, this was already a song been around since 1969, I think, or 68 when it was written, but they're singing it in a kikar. So that's where you ring out, when you ring it out and you ring out peace, and the word is hariu, to ring out the prayer for peace. Hariu is from the word trua, which is one of the notes of the shofar, when you say trua, and then it's shiru, shir shalom. Let us sing a song of peace. And the word shir in Hebrew, it means song and it also means poem. Hebrew it's the same word, means both song and poem. So it's you ring it out, you sing it, but it's also the music of the words as well as the sound. Al techashu tefillah. Okay, don't let the tefillah means a prayer. Telchashu means don't be lachash. Lachash is quiet. Don't be silent. Don't say it quietly. Ring it out like you're blowing the shofar. Mutav teshiru shir leshalom. It's better to sing a song of peace, but se'aka gedola. Gedola is large. That's the adjective that is modifying. Sa'aka means a shout, right? And this is again shouted from the rooftops, is what it's saying. It's a triumphant song about the establishment of peace, which is why it was one of the favorite songs of the peace movement in Israel. It was somewhat controversial, this song, because it was so tied with the peace side. And that's why Rabin didn't know the words, and he had to be given the words. And the incredibly emotional moment it must have meant for those 100,000 of people in the crowd to watch Yitzhak Rabin sing this song, because you saw the aide puts the microphone up to his mouth and him singing along in his careful, articulate voice. And then his life was taken from him as he had that in his pocket. It's a tragedy. There's no doubt it's a tragedy. The question is whether the action of the song is saying to shout out peace because it recognizes that it's still a tefillah, it's still a prayer, it's still aspirational, it's not established. But the song is saying, the point of the song is that it's establishable, it's doable today. It's not something that, who knows when. And that's the danger of where we are with Israel now, that there's this sense of defeatism, like there will never be a peace, we'll never resolve these problems. And we don't have to be at that situation. There shouldn't be problems that we can't resolve. That throughout the long arc of our history that we've been looking at over this year, right? There's been so many times when it looked like there was no way out, and yet we found a solution, and a solution was found. I have no doubt that a solution will be found out of the issues and the tensions that face Israel and the Jewish people now. And when those are found, then we'll move into a future that's certainly more secure than the problems that we face today. But I also sure it will have new problems and new challenges that we can't even imagine. So that's what I got for you tonight. Again, thank you for your patience. Sorry for that loss of connection there. Thanks for sticking with me for all these months, and we can take a few minutes for any comments or questions. Thank you.
Yashikor, Yashikor, Rabbi.
Okay.
Yeah, Rabbi.
Thank you. Rabbi Gloria's got her hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, did you want to speak for a few minutes or not about the divisions in the Jewish community itself that led to his assassination? Because that's also affected life in Israel. He was called a Rodef.
Yeah, the divisions were that the government lost its Jewish majority. It was, as I said, it was a very polarizing time. And the criticism of him from the right was that he was basically called an illegitimate leader. His legitimacy as the premier was being challenged. So yeah, there were on the far right, there were called, I remember I lived in Israel then when there was, it would be pictures of Rabin's face with a keffiyeh, which was Arafat's headgear under Rabin's face. There were pictures of Rabin in an SS uniform, as he's destroying the Jewish people. There was terrible hatred. But Rabin never let that bother him. He just knew, oh, those are crazies, and he dismissed it and probably should have taken his own security more seriously. And this was also a failure of the Israeli Secret Service to not take those type of threats seriously. They were so focused on terrorist threats, not looking at Jewish threats. But the real division, like you mentioned, as I said, the polarization was a more basic polarization. The issue wasn't the extremists who were calling the prime minister a Nazi. The issue was that the majority of the Jewish population was not sold for the peace, for moving forward, because the opposition was so strong. And there was that mix that made it that, and then the developing hatred of the right against him was what led, no way a majority of Israelis support the assassination, and it put Netanyahu in a difficult position too, because he was at some rallies where the hatred was spewed, and then he condemned it then, when but then soon after he got himself elected. But that's why also I think that's why I argued that it's Sharon's stroke that is more of a turning point than Rabin's assassination, because the difference between Sharon and Rabin was that Sharon had a control of the Knesset in a way Rabin did not. Rabin had control by a majority of one, including Arab votes. Sharon had a strong Jewish majority, and the election that they were moving towards, Kadima was supposed to win the election by a landslide. So the polarization was not, there were a lot of people that were angry with Sharon over the Gaza withdrawal, but not the same thing as for Rabin. So yes, is driven by the internal strife.
I was thinking specifically of the language that the far right used in criticizing him. They used Rodef language.
Right.
And halachically, you're not only allowed to, but you're required to kill a Rodef.
Right. A Rodef is someone is assailing you. You have the right to kill the assailant.
Or assailing someone else.
Self-defense.
Pursuing someone else, right?
Right.
Pursuing
Save
someone
else's
else
life
them.
by killing
Right.
the assailant. Yes.
And that caused as I recall, and maybe I'm recalling it correctly, that caused a whole reexamination of political language. Now, I don't think it's held, but in that moment, it caused, what have we done? This guy who killed him came out of the yeshiva world.
But I think that those are more effects rather than causes. I mean, those are effects of the polarization, and that it drove rhetoric. When you have a polarizing, we know it's our own country. When the country is polarized, then extreme rhetoric, it's surprising how many people believe things that we might think are unbelievable. I mean, we've seen many examples of that in our own country over the last year.
For sure. Well, I think I'm a little more sensitive to it because I went to Ohio to campaign for Obama, and I was taken around, and the Jewish newspapers there were using Rodef language about Obama. So that's why I'm bringing it up, and that's why I think it's important to look at.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Comments or questions?
I hope I didn't shut down discourse.
Oh, Rabbi,
Yes, Stacy.
who were the extremists that, I know I can look it up, but who were the extremists that did it? What was their fate?
Exactly.
What was their fate?
Yes.
Well, the assassin went to prison.
Okay.
But you can't, but what Rabbi Laurie is pointing out, I mean, there was hateful discourse that came out of the yeshiva world that was allied with the, with the right-wing nationalists, the settler movement, and a lot of, that a lot of the groups that continue to make news in Israel, that was giving, was legitimizing the political violence in the same way. I mean, you have why would someone become an assassin? Assassin is a politically motivated murder. So the person who commits the assassination is a part of a movement usually, and is an extreme movement that supports violence and justifies it. And it's not the, it's unfortunately something that has happened a lot. And
they
that,
use
so
electric language.
yeah. But it's yeah, the language is a part of it. But as I said, I mean, maybe with just, it's a little different in the nuance. I as I said, I think that's a reflection of, it's driven by the polarization, that you're always going to have extremes. And the danger that we've seen in so many places in the world now is the extreme discourse is being utilized for political purposes, for legitimate political purposes, in order to get, in order to win votes and win political power through the democratic system. Then those were voices that were there, but it wasn't the platform, of a party coming into power. So we've seen a move towards, more dangerous parties in countries all across the world over the last decade that is cause for concern. Walter, I see your hand up.
Now, your
Put that-
original
Did you put our hand
question
up?
was, what if, okay, so what if Rabin had not been assassinated? How would the picture of Israel now look like? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it would have looked similar to what Ehud Barak tried to do and what Ariel Sharon tried to do. I mean, I think that you would have, I would have been closer to Barak's, not quite as liberal as Barak, not quite as conservative as Sharon, probably somewhere in the middle. I don't think Rabin would have been prepared to, it would have taken a tougher line in Jerusalem, but there would have been a wider withdrawal, broader withdrawal of Israeli troops, and the recognition of the Palestinian Authority, a final agreement that would have included a final agreement that would have included recognition of sovereignty. And once Israel and the Palestinians worked that out, then the Palestinian sovereignty would have been accepted everywhere else through the world. It would have been a Palestinian state with certain security rights preserved for the Israeli army to maintain the concerns for security. I think that's why Rabin was able to push forward with enough support, because he had sold the skeptics that he, unlike, that he was driven by security concerns. So I think you would have seen an Israeli military base, on the other side of Palestinian territory, in the same way, for example, that the U.S. military maintained bases in Germany and in Japan after World War II. So you would have, you would have those type of guarantees for Israel's security concerns, and the midst of the agreement. And it wouldn't have been so unimaginable to have islands of the Israeli army on the other side of the border, because between 1949 and 1967, Mount Scopus was an island of Israel in the middle of Jordan, because Jordan controlled East Jerusalem and the old city. Mount Scopus is in East Jerusalem. It's where the main campus of the Hebrew University is. And Mount Scopus remained under Israeli control, and it wasn't used by the university then, although now it's the main campus. It was used as a military outpost, and the Israeli army had right of access to it through the Jordanian lines. So it wouldn't have been that complicated. Nothing's not complicated, but it certainly would have been feasible to work out something where there would have been guarantees for Israeli security, both broad security, regional, in terms of the land that they would be giving up, as well as the cooperation that they already established working with the the Palestinian Authority in terms of policing against terrorists and other threats to Israeli security from within the Palestinian areas. And I imagine that that's what would have been set up. And according to most analysts, that's what the ultimate agreement is going to eventually have to look like. There's no idea that's not on the table. What's not on the table, which is what Alan Sanders had said after Shul, we spoke, it was about a week and a half ago, Alan, that what's not on the table, the right leaders on the both sides. And that's what we had on the table before, and we don't have now, at least on our side. So that's what the tragedy is. Not losing the ideas, but losing the leadership that was prepared to push it through. Do I see that? I see there's a bunch of comments there in this comments. Hold on, let me catch up there. Okay, I was okay. Joe Rosen, you were there when the song debuted. That's fantastic, Joe. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that. Okay, and okay. So Jake Haber is asking: the recent Abraham Accords have thus far held up to this latest flare-up. Do you think the new relationships will one day lead the Israelis and Gulf states to present the Palestinian Authority with a take it or leave it deal, Sharon style? It's certainly possible. It would, I think Saudi Arabia would have to come on board in order for that to happen, because Saudi Arabia is what's missing from the Abraham Accords, right? We got the Emirates, Bahrain, and then we worked out the deal with Sudan, and a lot of that is you give tremendous credit to Netanyahu, right? And he was the finance minister, by the way, under Sharon before he split from Sharon. And we think of Netanyahu as just as in terms of security issues, but he really built his career in Israeli politics for shoring up the Israeli economy, Israel's version of the Silicon Valley of the Middle East, and made it a business deal that the Emirates couldn't afford to. They're only hurting themselves by not being able to have a deal with Israel where they can do business with each other. But Saudi Arabia is missing. And if Saudi Arabia could join and support in recognizing Israel, and if you had their cooperation, then I think that would certainly, that would be a strong position between the Arab countries and in alliance with Israel, and Israel to force the Palestinians to accept the circumstances. Iran's not going to join in. Syria, whatever's left of Syria, is not going to join in. But without Saudi Arabia's cooperation, I don't think that the countries in the Abraham Accords have enough clout within the Arab world, within the Arab League, to push through an accord. Joe Landau, is that your hand? Go ahead.
What makes you presume that the other side, someone like Abbas, would accept a redrawn borders just similar to what happened in Gaza? I mean, it wasn't just the Sharon that could make the decision. There has to be another side to accept the border or the consequences, and this whole idea that we could have gotten to a certain point by drawing a map and just saying that this is the way it's going to be doesn't really make sense to me.
So the reason why I think Abbas would have accepted it is because he said he would have accepted it. He has publicly said he would accept the peace offer that Barak put on the table in Camp David II. He has said that by Marion, and also because of we've learned from what happened, that he was willing to accept the plan that was negotiated under him with Ehud Olmert. Now, Ehud Olmert's offer would have been much closer to what Sharon would have done than Barak, because Barak was the leader of the Labor Party. Ehud Olmert was a lifelong Likudnik. He is and until he left for Kadima, and he was Sharon's right-hand man. Ehud Olmert was the right-wing mayor of Jerusalem who did everything he could to, with Sharon, to spread Jewish control over the whole of Jerusalem, to make it difficult for the Palestinian Accord to pull it apart into two cities. And yet Olmert offered something that, what we've learned, is that Abbas was willing to admit he just didn't agree to. He just didn't want to agree to it with a lame duck prime minister. So the idea is that had Tzipi Livni then received the premiership, then she would have had the same thing on the table that Olmert had, and Abbas was prepared to accept it. We have every indication that he would have. The reason why he didn't accept it wasn't because he changed his mind, it's because Tzipi Livni did not become prime minister. Now, that's not saying that Abbas is off the hook. Of course, I mean, Abbas had many opportunities to make it work. So, and he should have accepted it, should have made the deal with Olmert, or not waited. And there were many other times he could have worked it out, and is not doing anything extraordinary now to move things forward either. So I'm not in any way defending Abbas's leadership. Don't misunderstand me, right? I'm just saying that the indications are that when there was an opportunity, it seemed like he would have accepted either, and it's just that the timing wasn't right when Olmert offered it, and then it wasn't offered again because the leadership, Israeli politics changed and shifted to the right. Lynn, you had your hand up? You have to unmute there. Lynn and Michael? Lynn, are you there? No, there you are.
Can you hear?
Yes,
Rabbi,
we can hear you.
why have you not brought up or not glossed over, you just haven't brought up Sharon's involvement or precipitation of, I forgot whether it was the first or the second Intifada, when he I forgot exactly where he went into, but that killed the peace process.
Sharon, yes, it was
in Israelis' minds. The Intifada completely destroyed any prospect of peace.
It's a good question. So I'm happy it was, yes, I didn't speak about it. It wasn't that I glossed over it.
No, you didn't speak about it.
Yeah, right.
Which I feel is one of the most tragic events
yes.
of Israel's history.
Right. That was when Sharon was the leader of the Likud party, and he was in opposition, and he was the opposition leader, and he did it's right in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, where we've had tensions now. He walked up there and with a triumphantly and a very public show of Israeli sovereignty over the holiest of Muslim sites, and that was what triggered the second Intifada. But that's not the only. If you want to blame Sharon, you don't have to point to that. There's the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon that he bears culpability for. That was the South Lebanese army had massacred Arabs in the refugee camps there. The atrocity wasn't committed by the Israeli army, but the Israeli army could have prevented it from happening, is what most of the studies have shown. And Sharon was the commanding officer of the Israeli army in the Lebanon war in 1981, 82. And Sharon allowed this massacre to happen and continued to bear his life real responsibility for it. That's why when he became prime minister, there was outrage. This was a war criminal who was becoming the prime minister. But it's because, and you could say that also, if you talk about why is there so much Palestinian hatred of Israel, and why would drive a people to turn to such hatred, and some of them, no, not necessarily a majority, to support terrorist attacks? Well, it's because of incidents like that, because of massacres that were committed when Israel was culpable. But it's because of that history, and it's because of Sharon's instigation, unwittingly or not, of the Second Intifada, that is specifically what gave him such potential to work through the peace. That was why he was able to command a larger Jewish majority towards the unilateral withdrawal than Rabin was ever able to command, because he was to the right of Nixon, Sharon. He was to the right of Nixon, and he was walking into the Forbidden City. Right? He's not just Nixon in China. Right? So if Sharon could do it, anyone could do it. And the fact that Netanyahu managed to carve out an opposition to the right of Ariel Sharon is unbelievable, because who could have been to the right of Ariel Sharon? Right? And that's the story, what happened. So it's because of that background, which is why Sharon, why he was able to get Ehud Olmert with him and Tzipi Livni and other people that were the bedrock of the Likud party. That was what lined up the votes to move beyond the Palestinian conflict, because that was what Kadima meant. Kadima means let's go. Enough of this already. We have to move on, and we have to cut our losses and move on. So yes, I should have brought it up, because it's specifically because of that background that made him credible. Analogous to Rabin's background as being the commanding general during the Six-Day War, but even more powerfully and emotionally than with Sharon there, which makes his stroke that much more of a turning point. Not tragic in the way that Rabin's assassination was tragic, right? It's not comparable on the moral level. Rabin was assassinated by a fellow Jew who was, driven up to this extreme position because of discourses Rabbi Gloria mentioned that came out of the right-wing yeshiva world. Right? There was nothing like that with Sharon. Sharon had a stroke. Also, Sharon had a very checkered past. He wasn't, he as an important leader, but I wouldn't say, I loved Yitzhak Rabin. I couldn't say that about how I feel about Ariel Sharon. Didn't love Ariel Sharon, but I think he could have gotten us much further along than where we are now. And that's also, there's a truth in that sometimes it's not necessarily the best people, it's the ones who have the ability, who have the right pieces on the board that are able to make something happen. They're not necessarily the people you might want to make it happen, but sometimes they're the people who can. It's like Menachem Begin. He was the one who was able to withdraw from Sinai. If it was a labor prime minister, it would have been a disaster in Israel. But Begin was able to pull it off because Begin was the Irgun leader. He was the one who fought against Ben Gurion. He was the crazy right-wing Jewish extremist. And he was the one who made the peace with Egypt and withdrew from Sinai. So Sharon is in the direct line of Menachem Begin in that sense. And the fact that Sharon was willing to do something and then he wasn't able to finish the job is the accident of history that kind of, and if you're taking a broader view, kind of took us off course to where we are now, in my opinion.
Very interesting perspective. Never thought about it that way.
Thank you. All right, again, folks, thanks. The Q&A was great. Let me just, I didn't miss any other
Looks like
comments.
Alan wanted to say something, Rabbi.
So, sorry? Alan, oh, go ahead, Alan. You're always welcome. I think he's going to press the mute.
I have to get up to press.
No problem.
Yeah, I really thank you very much for this presentation. I totally agree with you that, at these various tipping points, what you need is a strong leader. And I think you pointed out exactly the importance of Begin and Sharon, but I would also say Yitzhak Rabin, because of being the hero of the Six-Day War. You need people who are strong leaders and who can carry forward. And typically, and what's quite amazing is that the two leaders that you pointed out in your lecture were military leaders. They were not politicians, they were military leaders. They converted and became politicians, but they were strong because of their military background. So I guess my question is, who do you see on the horizon right now? I mean, that may be a very complicated question. The reason I ask is, we don't know what's going to happen with Israel because of the Israeli elections, the corruption trial of the prime minister, Netanyahu. But what's intriguing to me is that Abbas is a very old and very sick man. He's not very healthy. And so I hear names being bandied about on the Palestinian side as possible successors. And I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts as to who might succeed, but beyond who might succeed, who you might see as a strong leader of the Palestinians who would have the courage and the following to make a peace deal with Israel in the current environment.
So thanks, Alan. And so I say it, the advantage professionally about being an historian rather than a political scientist is I only have to interpret things that happened. I don't have to deal with the present or the future, just the past. But my real job is a rabbi, so I guess I do have to look forward. And I think that you're right. Abbas is old, and we're talking about this actually on Friday night, that nobody lives forever, and he won't live forever. And so there will be a change of leadership sooner or later on the Palestinian side. I don't think Abbas, I think with this age, I don't see him doing anything in his remaining years. Be happy to be surprised. Yeah, I have no idea what's going to, with Israel, I think that if the Palestinian leadership change, you have a strong leader who's able to make a proposal kind of the way that Sadat did, right? When Sadat took that action, that whoever is in charge in Israel is going to have to respond. We may have a leader like your Lapid may be able to come into power and move it forward on his end. I'd love to see Tzipi Livni come back. There's a history in Israel of leaders that lost to somehow get second chances and come back into power. So there are people that can speak for the center in Israel and work something out. It's going to be much harder, someone that comes from the left, from the labor side to do that. But I wouldn't even write off Netanyahu yet either. Certainly he's found ways to stay in power. But if there's a change on the Palestinian side where you have a leader who's willing to be a partner, I wouldn't write off Netanyahu stepping up and working that out. I don't believe that Netanyahu is principally on the extreme right. I think that Netanyahu found himself there because he had to get to the right of Sharon. It was the way for him to, then come into power. And if the situation changed where he was able to take the Likud and move it with and lead a centrist coalition, rather than relying on the extreme right that has not been able to produce the 61 magic votes in the Knesset that he needs, I don't think it's out of the cards for him to do that as well.
I mean, I share your idea that he could be the strong leader that makes the move that the Israelis need to make to reach a peace. What I'm concerned about is, and I don't have an answer to that, is I don't see a leader of similar strength and similar ability on the Palestinian side. And that's the troubling aspect, that there's nobody there with the following and with the strength and with the record of the past to move the path of peace forward, and that's the concern. I don't know, but there may be, I'm not an expert on Palestinian politics, so I don't know if there's anybody there. But if there were, then I think maybe as an outcome of this latest conflict, there may be possible moves that both the administration, the Israeli government, and the Palestinian Authority might be able to make. But you need somebody on the Palestinian side, and I don't know if there is anybody.
You need someone, or alternatively, you need a unified position of everyone else. But like I said, if Saudi Arabia decided to join, then maybe they could, just dictate things. But without that, it's not enough of a coalition of agreement now. But again, we don't know. I mean, once the leadership changes, people come up and we can be surprised. The people that come into leadership are not always the ones that we expect. Sometimes,
Good point. Good point.
thank you all again. This has been a great journey, a fun way to think through the moments of Jewish history. So next year, we're going to do the history of anti-Semitism, what I had mentioned, and I'm probably going to work it out. I think that, this year we did one talk a month, so we spread it out. I think we'll try to do them closer together, so it's easier to maintain, from one class to the next. So I don't have to remember, because I think it might have been hard with the amount of time that lapsed between one. So that's my plan as we work on the schedule for next year. It'll start after the holidays, which is sooner than you think, because Rosh Hashanah Erev Rosh Hashanah is Labor Day, but don't be strangers before then.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're
Good night,
welcome.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank
Nice
you.
seeing you all.
Nice to see you, Walter.
See you again.
Good to
I'm
see
really
you
happy.
too, Walter.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, Walter.
There's a general membership meeting Wednesday night. Everybody should come.
Can all see each other again.
Send it around. Maybe I
And
will.
that's going to be in person also, right, Joe?
But yeah,
In
it's
person
hybrid.
or on Zoom.
Hybrid.
It was a great meeting.
1 foot in and 1 foot out.
Feel more
Just like the
comfortable.
cars. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful class.
Thank you.